Welcome to SS2 Islamic Religious Studies. This lesson examines Islamic teaching on gender, the rights and roles of men and women in Islamic jurisprudence, the Quranic foundations of gender relations, and how Muslim scholars and communities debate gender equality today. The Quran establishes several foundational principles regarding men and women. Spiritual equality. Surah 33:35 is one of the most comprehensive verses on gender equality in the Quran. It states that Muslim men and women, believing men and women, devout men and women, truthful men and women, patient men and women, humble men and women who give charity, men and women who fast, men and women who guard their chastity, and men and women who remember God abundantly, for all of them God has prepared forgiveness and an immense reward. This verse is cited by Islamic scholars as establishing complete spiritual equality between men and women before God. Human dignity. Surah 17:70 states that God honored the children of Adam, making no distinction between male and female in terms of basic human dignity. The primacy of taqwa. Surah 49:13 states that the most honored among you in the sight of God is the most righteous, again, making righteousness not gender the criterion of honor. These verses are foundational for Muslim scholars who argue that Islamic teaching provides a strong basis for gender equality in spiritual and moral terms. Islamic jurisprudence established rights for women that were revolutionary in 7th century Arabia and compared favorably with many contemporary legal systems for centuries. Property rights. Islamic law gave women full property rights. A woman's property is hers alone, not her husband's. The Quran in Surah 4:32 states that men have a portion of what they earn and women have a portion of what they earn. This meant that even in marriage, a Muslim woman's wealth was legally separate and protected. Dowry. The bride receives a marriage gift, as her own property, not her father's. This gave women financial independence and security. Inheritance. Surah 4:11-12 established that women inherit, daughters inherit half the share of sons, and wives, mothers, and sisters all receive defined shares. While the half-share rule is debated by contemporary scholars, the very establishment of female inheritance rights was significant in 7th century Arabia. Consent in marriage. Classical Islamic jurisprudence requires the consent of the bride for a valid marriage contract. Education. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, "Seeking knowledge is an obligation upon every Muslim, no gender distinction in this hadith." Several of his wives, notably Aisha, were major scholars and teachers whose hadith narrations form a significant part of the hadith corpus. There are several areas of gender relations where contemporary Muslim scholars debate how Islamic principles apply in the modern context. Leadership and political authority. Classical Islamic jurisprudence generally restricted the position of caliph or head of state to men. Contemporary scholars debate, firstly, whether this restriction was based on Quranic principle or on the specific social conditions of early Islamic society. Secondly, the example of Khadija bint Khuwaylid, the Prophet's first wife, who was a successful businesswoman and employer, and thirdly, the example of the Queen of Sheba, BECE, mentioned in the Quran, 27:23-44, whose governance was not condemned by the Quran. Many Muslim-majority countries have had female heads of government including Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Turkey, and Senegal. Women's testimony and legal standing. Classical jurisprudence held that in financial matters, the testimony of two women equals that of one man, Surah 2:282. Contemporary scholars debate whether this applied to financial transactions specifically in 7th century Arabia where women did not typically engage in commerce, or is a universal principle. Women's dress and hijab. There is significant scholarly debate about the extent and form of Islamic dress requirements for women, from the view that only modest dress is required, to the niqab, or face veil, being obligatory. The verse in Surah 24:31 commanding women to cover their adornment is interpreted variously by different scholarly traditions. Gender issues in Muslim communities in Nigeria intersect with both Islamic jurisprudence and cultural traditions that sometimes predate Islam or differ between ethnic groups. In northern Nigeria, the practice of Pada, the seclusion of women within the home is practiced in some communities, particularly in Hausa Fulani tradition. Islamic scholars debate whether purdah is an Islamic requirement or a cultural tradition. Child marriage is practiced in some parts of northern Nigeria and is justified by some with reference to Islamic tradition, while other Islamic scholars argue that the conditions of 7th century Arabia, where girls matured earlier and life expectancy was shorter, are not applicable today, and that the higher maqasid objectives of Islam require protecting children. Girls' education. The Chibok schoolgirl kidnappings by Boko Haram in 2014 dramatized the issue of girls' education in the north. Islamic scholars have consistently cited the Prophet's hadith on seeking knowledge as establishing the Islamic obligation to educate girls, as well as the example of Aisha as a great Islamic scholar. Women's economic participation. Islamic law gives women full rights to own businesses and earn income, as practiced by the Prophet's own first wife Khadija. Expanding women's economic participation is therefore argued to be consistent with Islamic teaching. Today we covered that the Quran establishes spiritual equality between men and women, Surah 33:35, 17 hours 70 minutes, 49:13. Islamic jurisprudence provided women with property rights, inheritance rights, consent in marriage, and the right to education, rights that were ahead of many contemporary legal systems. Contemporary debates continue around leadership, testimony, dress, and cultural practices like purdah and child marriage. In each case, Muslim scholars distinguish between Quranic principle and cultural accretion. In Nigeria, Islamic scholarship supports girls' education and women's economic participation. For your essay exercise, using specific Quranic verses, explain the Islamic basis for women's rights in marriage, particularly regarding consent, and property ownership, and discuss why these provisions were significant in the historical context of 7th century Arabia.